So, what are the freest countries in the world, and how do you even categorize that? I mean, obviously, there's a lot of opinions with respect to political freedom, economic freedom, personal freedom. Well, we've looked at a couple of indexes by the Fraser Institute, by the Cato Institute, by the Heritage Foundation, to go ahead and look at these numbers over time in order to bring you something of a comprehensive list of the 5 freest countries in the world. Not to mention the fact that I think we're going to have we're going to take some issues with some of the countries that are listed as the most free. Also, we're going to talk about where the United States falls on this list, along with where it fell in this list a decade ago versus where it is now, some of the disturbing trends that have taken place. But as always, there's some good news. There's some good news that the United States can, in fact, pull this off. And in part, it's because of which country is actually the freest, ranked as the freest in the world today. All of that and more coming up in this episode of Making the Argument.
No matter where you are watching today's live stream, we would love to take your questions. If you have a question, please start your comment off with question and then ask your question. And that way we can see it and make sure we get to it. If you haven't already, head down to the link in the description to join our community chat. There's a lot of fun stuff going on there. We'll be discussing this topic right after the show. And thank you so much for joining us.
All right, as always, I'm your host, Nick Freitas, member of the Virginia House of Delegates, but other than that, a reasonably good guy. With me, as always, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Oh, you said it right this time. Hello, everyone.
Then we have Christian Hines, our political prognosticator and resident historian.
Hey, how you doing?
And then our producer of producers, Nicholas Hamilton.
You're not going to answer my question?
No, I'm not. Nicholas Hamilton, the good Hamilton, the one that doesn't like central banking.
Thank you, Nick.
All right, let's get right into it. Nothing too super controversial today on the episode. At least give us some time. We can probably find something. But we just wanted to go through this idea because there's this interesting report that the Cato and the Fraser Institute put out called the Index of Human Freedom. There's also another report that the Heritage Foundation puts out called the Index of Economic Freedom. And this is something I've tracked for several years now. I've always found it really interesting. Heritage Foundation's website on this is actually super easy to use. Cato and Fraser, not so much. Cato, love you guys, but you got to up your game on interactive websites, especially with this sort of data. So what we decided to do was go through this and look at, okay, what makes a free country, because there's a huge disagreement right now. It used to be that most people kind of agreed on what constituted being a free country. And typically when people on the right talk about freedom, we're generally talking about freedom from oppression, freedom from government oppression, or being able to live in an environment where you could extend it to living in an environment where you're not living in constant fear of somebody else coming in and taking your stuff, right? That's how we define freedom. The left and the progressive movement defines freedom a little bit differently. And by a little bit, I mean a lot of bit, right? They generally define it as being free from want. In fact, FDR talked about this in his 4 freedoms, and that was one of the things he listed was being free from want, which conservatives consider to be kind of absurd. So when we looked at this, we said, all right, what are some institutions or organizations that are going to rank human freedom in a way that we think actually makes sense with our worldview, and that we can have a discussion about the way that progressives might rank freedom. Because again, they include a bunch of other things that we don't. They include a lot of things which are known as positive rights. So when you talk about, freedom to healthcare, freedom to housing, freedom to food, right? We have a problem with that because how can you possibly have an inherent or a God-given right to products and services? Because to have an inherent right to products and services means that somebody else is obligated to provide them in some way, right? Whereas negative rights focus primarily on preventing the government or others from being able to infringe on your God-given rights, right? So you having the freedom of speech or freedom of religion doesn't require anyone to provide you with something, right? We get this all the time where the left will come out and say, well, how can you truly be free if you have to, work to survive or you have to go into debt in order to pay for healthcare bills? And then we'll say, oh, okay, well then if that's your definition of freedom, then the government owes me a firearm, right? Because the Second Amendment guarantees my right to keep and bear arms. How can I keep and bear arms if the government doesn't provide me a firearm? And they'll instantly shoot back and be like, what? That's not what it means. It means you have the right to have a firearm if you want one. It doesn't mean that we have to provide one through tax dollars. Oh, is that how rights work? Yes, exactly. right? You have a right to pursue happiness, right? You have a right to live your life the way you want, provided you're not infringing on the rights of others to do the same. But you can't have a right to other people's property. You can't have a right to their labor. And the only way you can have a right to products and services in the way that they're talking about it is that if you do have a right to the property or labor of other people. And last time I checked, we kind of fought a big war over this in the United States. Not allowed to do that. All right, so let's go through and look at the executive summary here from the Human Freedom Index. This is our version of defining the terms so everyone kind of knows where we're coming from. All right, so they look at these. They said this 8th annual index uses 83 distinct indicators of personal economic freedom in the following areas: rule of law, security and safety, movement, religion, association, assembly, and civil society, expression and information, relationships, size of government, legal system and property rights, sound money, freedom to trade internationally, and regulation. So those are the broad categories. And then you're going to see as we go through and we kind of ask some questions about like, okay, why did this country rank so high? We'll look at some of the areas where they ranked lower, where they ranked higher. And if we need any more clarification on why they ranked it a particular way, we can do that. Now, I'm just going to say right off the bat, I don't necessarily agree with everything that they came up with as being, as comprehensive as I would have liked it. All right. But with that said, these are the terms that we're working with right now. Let's go ahead and go to the 5th freest country in the world, and that's right, it is Ireland. Ireland ranks 5th in the world, so it ranks 4th out of 165 countries on personal freedom, and it ranks 10th on economic freedom. So one of the things that's interesting about this has been actually watching the trend that Ireland has been taking over time. So you see where they were in 2000. They were down ranked around 15, so they're still in the top 20. Shot up to like the second or third spot, and now they're hovering around the 5th, right? So they've actually been doing pretty good. Now, what does that mean? So let's go ahead and scroll down here just a little bit so we can look at what we're talking about. So rule of law, they're like a 7.8 overall. Procedural justice, this has to do with kind of like the practical application of going through the justice system. Then you have your civil. So again, when you're trying to go through processes or adjudicate claims, things like that, civil justice, criminal law, that's all pretty straightforward. And they rank fairly high, right? 7.2, 7.4. Safety, security and safety, homicide, they're at 9.8. Disappearances, conflicts, and terrorism, 9.9. That's actually incredible because Ireland,
Considering their history.
well, keep in mind, most terrorism, even in Ireland, was usually in Northern Ireland, which is technically part of the UK. So it was around Belfast and whatnot. So it's not as if it was. But if you would have gone to the early 20th century, I'll tell you right now, disappearances, conflicts, and terrorism, Ireland would have been way down the list when it was before it became the Irish Free State. Movement, freedom of movement. And then when they talk about freedom of movement, they also talk about international. Now, keep in mind, Cato is very libertarian. So they tend to push toward kind of more open borders, more freedom of movement for immigration and economic purposes. So when they get a 6.7, they're scoring them lower on some of these things.
It's also worthy to note that this was pre-COVID.
Well, this is like right. So this is
right
this
as
is like
COVID
from
started to hit.
Yeah.
So like if you're thinking we saw a lot of lack of freedom the last few years, this isn't really encompassing all of that necessarily, which is why a lot of people are going to have a beef with this data.
Later in the
also, hold on. One thing I want to mention, I see people here from Switzerland and people from Sweden. If we mention your country, let us know you're here because I know we've got folks all over the world.
And if we screw up pronunciations, it's all Christian's fault.
No, that's definitely your fault because you called it 5 minutes ago the Irish Free State.
No, I didn't.
Yeah, you did.
It's Irish Free State.
No, comment section. Let Nick know that he called it the Irish Free State, not state.
Whatever.
But
we got somebody from Ireland. Yay.
it is worth mentioning that later in this episode we do have other sources, not just
other
this,
indexes we're going to go through
that are more recent too.
Yeah, and what we're going to spend a lot of time too going over here a little bit later on the episode, once we've kind of laid the groundwork for the countries that have been scoring the highest, is we're really going to do a strong comparison between the number one freest in the world and the United States and talk about some of the similarities and some of the differences. So as you can see, freedom of religion, freedom of association, assembly, civil society, all still pretty high within Ireland. Let's go over to the second column here. Go up here. Economic freedom. All right, this is one where they just, the 6.2 on size of government. You are going to see this across the board on a lot of countries that are otherwise economically free. One of the biggest problems they have is the size of government. So government consumption, to give you an idea what that means, they look at the total number of GDP and whatnot and government spending. One of the interesting things about GDP numbers, and one of the reasons why they can be a little bit misleading, is because GDP stands for gross domestic product, right? So what that means is everything, it's like the sum total of everything produced by a nation. Well, if the government comes in, prints off a ton of money, right, and then just spends it, your GDP goes up. Now, is that good policy? No, but you can use it to kind of manipulate it. Transfers and subsidies. This has to do with a lot of your welfare state issues. There's 6.9. Government investment 10. I mean I was pretty surprised on that. TARP marginal tax rate 4.5. State ownership of assets 7.6. Legal system and property rights pretty high across the board. The area where they get a little bit low is the legal enforcement of contracts, and some of that has to do with how onerous it is to go through the legal system. Go down. Sound money. They've actually done really well when it comes to sound money, comparatively speaking.
Can you explain sound money?
So sound money has to do with your overall monetary policy. It's basically about not only preventing inflation, but the degree to which people have confidence in the currency that your country produces. And the various methods that you use in order to control inflation. So overall, they're actually doing pretty well. You're going to see that they're doing better than the U.S. right now.
It's worth noting that they use the euro.
That's true. Freedom to trade internationally. Overall, they have very good. This one is an interesting. The black market exchange rates. They score very high on this one. So here's what the black market exchange rate means. It means when you're looking at what something would be sold for or what something would be exchanged for on the open market versus what it would be on the black market. If there's not a big difference between those two things, that's actually a good indication that prices are where they should be. They've achieved a natural equilibrium. So, for instance, when you have a society or you have a government that's constantly like raising tariffs, or it's putting a lot of regulations on certain goods or penalties or subsidies or whatever it is, what that does is it creates problems within the price system within your economy, and that encourages black markets to appear. Right. And so what you do is you look at how much does it cost to buy this on the black market versus how much does it cost me to buy it at Walmart? What's the differences there? That factors in. And then regulation overall, they do a pretty good job. So this is where Ireland's at. And again, for anybody that's in Ireland, that wants to comment on this, I visited Ireland back, in the late 90s, and it was beautiful. I mean, Ireland was a blast. I had a great time. I got to go Dublin, Kinsale, Ringadingle, like the whole area. It was awesome, beautiful country.
Weren't you in Dublin on St. Paddy's Day?
No, I was in a little village in the middle of Ireland on St. Patrick's Day, and I was there, and I had my cowboy hat and my boots in this like little village in the middle of Ireland, and I had so many people try to buy my cowboy hat off me. Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Did they all know that you were an American because of it?
Come on. I mean, well, I was 18. Drinking age in Ireland was 18. So
you took advantage of that.
I took advantage of that. So I'm sitting there in the pub. And it was just such an awesome environment, right? Like everyone was friendly. Nobody was mad or getting like overly drunk or like fights or anything like that. It was just very, very like kind of like family friendly atmosphere in this pub in Ireland on St. Patrick's Day. And yeah, this lady comes over and forgive for those of you who are from Ireland, forgive my horrible accent here. But it was, that's a lovely hat. I love that hat. Could I buy that hat off of you? And she brought the waitress over. She's like, look at the lovely American boy. Don't you want to talk to the lovely American? I'm like, oh, I have a girlfriend. Tina and I were dating.
Yeah.
Like, that's a lovely hat. But Ireland was great, and apparently one of the freest countries in the world. Very easy place to do business.
Well, it's worth noting they were not always. Hamilton, scroll up just a bit to the graph.
Don't
again.
they have like zero gun rights though?
Pause.
That's
vast majority
the
of European countries. Okay. Vast majority of countries in the world have very, very limited gun rights. I mean, the United States is the most pro-gun country in the world. Period.
Yeah. Like. Not even close.
Number 2 is way further down that list than the U.S. But
which means at any given moment, all these freedoms can be kind of evaporated into thin air.
To that point, actually, there's one thing that I want to bring up, and I'm not making excuses for this. I'm simply trying to explain that there's different cultures that exist out there than the U.S. In the U.S., we have a natural distrust towards government for good reason. Like our country was founded on a rebellion
It seems
against
like
government.
Ireland should feel the same.
Well, hang on.
Honestly,
I'm not talking
with-
about Ireland here. I'm talking about some of the
Oh,
countries
okay.
that are going to be brought up. In some of these other countries, Japan is a good example. There's a high level of trust in government in Japan. Same thing with Switzerland. Some of these countries, same thing with Singapore. Some of these countries around the world, they have the opposite relationship with their government that we do. In the U.S., we have a deep distrust of our government, and it's only gotten worse over the past 20, 30, 40 years. But in some of these other countries, there is a significant amount of public trust in their government. And also, their governments in some of these countries are the equivalent of like what we would call like our state governments, or in some cases, our county governments. So it's a different relationship. We look at Washington, D.C. I mean, we're what, 2 miles or 2 hours away from D.C., less than that, where we're broadcasting right now. And yet we, who's really geographically relatively close to DC, we still think DC is like an alien planet, right? But in some of these countries, they view their government as the equivalent of, you know, the way that we would view our state government or our county government, because the countries are much smaller and the communities are more tightly knit. And so they don't view government with the degree of distrust that we do. Is that to say that, oh, well, they're so much better than us? No, not necessarily. I think that our distrust of government is very warranted.
I actually thought it would be the other way around. This whole idea where, oh, they're better than us because they trust their government. I actually feel like a healthy distrust of government is a good thing.
I just said
Like,
it is
to
a
me,
good
that's
thing. But,
good. It's completely flipped.
but,
Well, I
but in
do-
some of these countries, the trust in their government is not unwarranted, is what I'm trying to say, at least until recently. Some of these countries, as we're going to get into in this podcast,
I'd love to know how that trust in government has shifted since throughout the
let's-
COVID.
yeah, I was
let's
about
go-
to say,
let's
some
go
of
to
these
move it.
countries
We got another
deserve
question.
a higher degree of distrust.
We got kind of a random question from Scott the Celt that I've got to answer. He goes, question: what should we do to get ineffectual leaders out of office? I'm of the mind to exile them like the ancient Greeks. What are your thoughts? The Greeks,
I'm cool with that.
The Greeks actually
Let's do it.
Greeks actually had a process. Was it once a year where it was called ostracizing, where you wrote the name of somebody, like a Greek official. I think the Athenians did this. I don't think it's all the Greeks did this, but I think the Athenians did this, where you could write the name of an official, and they got exiled for a certain number of years. Like they were forced to leave the country.
Demosthenes got exiled,
Yeah.
and then he came back and started a war with Macedon that they
Yeah.
lost.
Yeah, why not? I feel like we should do that.
So well,
Why
it was.
can't we do that?
It was interesting. There's actually some interesting stories on that. All right, let's go to the next country. So that was 5th in human freedom. What is 4th? Denmark. All right, Denmark is ranked 8th overall in personal freedom and 5th overall in economic freedom. Now here's something I want to point out right now that I think is interesting. Bernie Sanders, everyone else loves to point to Scandinavian countries, Denmark being one of them, Sweden being another one, where he says like, oh, see, socialism works. Look at these places. And I think it was Denmark, the prime minister of Denmark felt compelled to actually come out and explain, like, we are not a socialist country.
That was in 2016 when that happened.
Yeah. Now they do have a fairly sizable social welfare state, and I would certainly question the overall economic freedom based off of their tax burden, because their tax burden is pretty high. In Denmark, but they make it easy to do other things like own a business. And this is one
They
of these,
have no minimum wage.
Yeah, this is one of these areas where I look at Cato and I'm like, okay, how are you ranking some of this? Because when I look at overall tax burden, I think that should actually play a little bit higher role.
So there's
But and keep in mind, this is comparatively speaking. When every country raises their taxes, when every country raises their regulations because of COVID and whatnot, well then that's going to affect all the rankings.
one thing that I think is going to be really gotten across to our audience over the course of this podcast is that there actually truly are few rivals to the United States. There are some, but there are few rivals to the United States when you look at the total picture, because a lot of these countries. Did we actually reveal yet what rank the U.S. is at? Okay, so I'm going to hold that off. We're going to get to that later, but when you find out what rank the U.S. has, you're going to be like, wow. But you have to consider both personal and economic freedom put together. There's actually very few countries in this world that rank higher than the U.S. in both of those categories. There's a lot that rank higher than the U.S. in one or the other. particularly in personal freedom more than economic freedom. There's actually very few countries that can compete with the United States in terms of economic freedom. There are a couple, though.
Yeah.
We'll get to them over the course
and the other
of this
thing you're going to notice
podcast.
by a lot of these countries is that they are significantly smaller than the United States.
By the way, dark.
That gets back to what I was saying, that like they view their government the way that we would view our like city,
You mentioned some of these people calling these countries socialist, and you attributed that to Denmark, but somebody, Dark Matter, says that it was Sweden.
No, there was a couple. It wasn't just
okay.
Sweden. Yeah. You got to understand, Sweden was one that they commonly pointed to as being a socialist country, and it really wasn't.
They have certain types of socialized
what
services.
it is they have a large social welfare state. They might have a large safety net or things like that. But to call them socialism is the abolition of the private ownership of the means of production. I got in a big fight with Lee Carter on this one. Lee Carter used to be a member of the Virginia House of Delegates.
Me, Lee.
Poor me,
I want to
Lee.
hear the story.
So Lee Carter was a member of the Virginia House of Delegates. He was the only member of a southern state legislature that was a self-identified socialist. And he got up there one day on the floor and just started going off about how socialism is just about wanting people to have a fair share and wanting access to healthcare and access to affordable housing and access to a job that will actually pay a livable wage and education for everyone, no matter your economic status. That's all we want as socialists. And so I got a bad one. I'm like, well, okay, that's adorable, right? Who doesn't want that, right? Who doesn't want people to have those things? Everybody here wants to have those things. You didn't actually distinguish. What you needed to talk about was, how does socialism achieve those things? Oh, I know. It's by seizing the means of production and putting it into the hands of government officials, who will then redistribute and allocate resources in accordance with political incentives. Oh, doesn't sound so sexy now, does it? I mean, I didn't say quite like that on the floor, but the point is that
maybe you should have. That would have been a viral moment
for
you.
It's this absolute garbage of, here's a bunch of good things that I want, and I'm a socialist, which means socialists are the people that want good things. No, socialism is a process. It is a mechanism for achieving your end states. And oh, by the way, it has a horrible track record of achieving those end states. And so what you've seen is they have gradually over time modified or attempted to modify the impression of what socialism is. So now if you have a military, people are like, well, that's a socialist institution. No, it isn't. It's a government institution. You can certainly make the argument that all governments in the West has moved more and more toward government control of things like retirement systems and healthcare, and I think that's problematic. But socialism is is essentially eliminating the free market economy as we know it today. So anybody that is trying to say that Denmark's socialist either knows nothing about Denmark or Sweden or knows nothing about socialism. Probably both.
There are some interesting things in the chat that I think are worth mentioning. Extreme FPS says, fun fact, Europe can have high taxes and have small militaries due to reliance on the U.S. military. Do you agree with that?
Correct.
I used to joke around that people say Europe doesn't have a strong, European countries don't have strong militaries. I'm like, yes, they do. They have the strongest military in the world. It's based in the United States. And it's largely responsible for maintaining world stability at this point, or in some cases, not so much. But the point is they have. Donald Trump was correct when he called out NATO for almost no NATO countries fulfilling their obligation to spend a certain minimum amount of their GDP. I think it was 2% of their GDP on defense spending. And their attitude was, why do we need to? The United States military spends 5%, plus. And so they did, I think, get to a point where they were able to transfer a ton of money into social welfare programs that they would have otherwise had to spend on defense if they couldn't rely on us.
You should see, I want to talk about that for a minute. You should see opinion polling of European countries that show the number of people per European country that say that they're willing to fight militarily to defend themselves or their neighbors, and the number of people in those countries that say that they believe the United States would get involved in order to militarily defend themselves or their neighbors. It's like universally throughout the entire European Union and beyond, overwhelming majorities of the public in these countries say that they think that the U.S. would get involved if a foreign country invaded, say, like Croatia. But overwhelmingly, the majority of these countries say, yeah, but I don't want to do anything to help them. In fact, this actually happened in Ireland. Ireland is not part of NATO.
No.
And when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was actually a debate within the Irish government of maybe we should apply for NATO. And the opposition said, no, we don't need to apply for NATO because if we ever get invaded, the United States will defend us. That's also why we don't need a military. My stepfather served in the military, and he was stationed in West Germany in the 1980s at the very height of the Cold War. Basically, like during the arms race under Reagan. And he told me, because he and I have had a lot of conversations about his time stationed in Western Europe when he was in the military. And he told me that of all the militaries that he worked with during his time in the service, he thought the West German army was the most worthless military force he ever interacted with. That's incredible. That somebody would be saying the Germans have a terrible military.
Yeah.
But like the historical narrative that we have on German military superiority is just not there anymore. And the reason why is because we subsidize them. We still have bases in Germany.
Well, you got to understand too that culturally in Germany there's a and for understandable reasons, right? There's a huge backlash against militarism in general. I
draw a distinction between militarism and having the capability to defend yourself.
Yeah, sure, fine, but when you're this goes into studies that they conducted about how French students, English students, and German students were taught about World War I. And after World War I, German students were essentially taught that the politicians had abandoned the military, stabbed in the back, right? In the UK, they had taught that, brave British went over to defend freedom. And in France, they taught them that war is a horrible thing and it's awful and everybody were victims of it. Well, in World War I, France fought to the, gosh dang it, I keep doing flubs. France fought to the absolute, bitter end. And then in World War II, 3 weeks and they were out.
Remember when I told you that in August 1914, France suffered 300,000 casualties in 1 month?
Yeah. We can't even fathom
that. Unthinkable today.
But that's the point. So let's
say we do have some people in the chat saying that they absolutely would defend their country. I think Switzerland is one that mentioned. So
well, let's go through. Let's look at Denmark.
They're the one exception. We'll get to them.
We're not trying to drag on anybody here. So
oops, I keep hitting cameras. All right, we're just all right. Let's move on. Let's get through Denmark here real quick. Let's scroll down. Let's look at some of the comparisons here. One of the things you're going to see right off the bat is that it's pretty similar to Ireland across the board on their freedom of movement, the freedom of religion, freedom of association, assembly, etc. Direct attacks on the press are a little bit higher over there. Their size of government, similar problem, right? Government consumption, top marginal tax rates, things like that. Here's what's so interesting about, forgive me if I pronounce your name wrong, but Jonas brought this up, and he's from Sweden. They have free market economies, but they have heavy public sector entities. So that's your big social safety nets and things like that. And what's problematic about this, because some people will look at this and be like, well, what is it? You just said that the freest countries in the world have huge, massive government spending. Isn't that a positive thing? I would argue that it is not, because over time, what ends up happening is the more the government sector takes over the economy, or the more the government is responsible for taking care of things that used to be the province of the individual or the family, the more reliance and dependency sets in, and that always has a negative long-term impact on your economy and on your country.
Look at the inflation rate that's currently gripping most of the Eurozone right now versus the United States. We've talked on this podcast many times before about inflation in the United States, and it has been historically very high compared to the long-term trajectory. Over the past 2 to 3 years, it's been really, really high. But the inflation rate in Europe is significantly worse than the United States. Significantly worse.
Well,
some of these countries still have high double-digit inflation, like close to 20% or 15%.
The UK went out of their way to just really hurt themselves on their monetary policy when they essentially they were increasing inflation at the same time that they were raising interest rates, which is crazy because usually you raise the interest rates, but they allowed this thing to buy back the equivalent of what they call treasuries. Or they don't call it treasuries. What do they call it?
They call them gilts.
Gilts.
This was last October.
Interesting name. But so they hurt themselves, and then the European Union has their own issues because they're connected by this monetary policy, but they have very, very different fiscal policies among various nations. And so that's the issue you see where, Germany and some of these other countries are constantly having to bail out other countries in Europe, especially places like Greece was probably the most, the largest example, where they had these massive social welfare. I mean, it's this idea in Greece that, you're retired 50 and you just live off of, okay, well, that doesn't work. And they ended up in a huge problem because of that. So
same thing in France, where people are literally rioting in the streets right now because they raised the retirement age to 64.
Yeah. Yeah. So many of these things end up, they're not a bad problem when you have a robust economy, but then as soon as you create generations dependent upon these systems, you end up having serious problems. Legal system and property rights, pretty good across the board. Legal enforcement of contracts, again, 6.6, that's their lowest one. Go down a little bit more. They're still giving them a high score on sound money. We'll see about that. And then movement of capital and people, again, they actually score a little bit higher. This is probably because, the EU actually has fairly lax immigration among all EU partner states.
Yeah, the Schengen area, you can walk across the border without needing to get a visa or get your passport stamped or anything like that.
Yeah.
Nick, on the MTA channel, MD asks, how do we return to sound money? Where should we start?
Oh gosh. So this is one of the most, I'll tell you right now, and this is the sad part, right? The only way I think you're probably going to return to sound money is after the fiat currency system that we has goes through such an abysmal crisis that it's required. Like, there's no other alternative, and that's the problem. Is that there's a lot of ways to slow down the train. There's a lot when you have a fiat currency. There's ways to slow down the train, right? There's ways to make things a little bit better or improve things. Raising interest rates is one of the ways that they're trying to take the inflation out of the economy. The problem is the political incentives to print money in order to justify more spending are so significant within our system that it's almost inevitable that eventually a purely fiat currency collapses in on itself or goes through some sort of significant crisis which requires significant alteration to the system. So do I ever think we're going to go back to when people say like the gold standard, a lot of people are like, oh, you're going to carry around gold coins? No, that's not what the gold standard means. What it essentially means is that you have your money, fiat currency, which is just it's paper, right? The government, it has value because the government says it has value and because people believe it has value, but it's not tied to anything with intrinsic value. So some sort of commodity-based currency where you're tied to something that has intrinsic value and that there's a limited amount of, right? That's why gold was so popular for a while. Or you had the silver standard, stuff like that. It's because when it's tied to that, you can't just print as much money as you want in order to feed your government spending habits. And so that's where I can see us going back to some sort of mechanism where it's tied to something objective and limited that will prevent the sort of out-of-control government spending. But I don't see it happening without a major crisis. All right, so that's Denmark. Let's go to number three. Number three on the list. Estonia. So
now it's getting interesting.
We've been in Europe the whole time.
Look
here.
at the trajectory of Estonia over the last 20 years.
Yeah, and so Estonia was ranking, it wasn't even in the top 20 back in 2000, and it is almost very consistently moved up the chain. There was a little dip there, it looks like, in 2012, but it has been rapidly going up. It's ranked 6 in personal freedom, 8 in overall economic freedom, and something that's really important to point out here, Estonia used to be a part of the Soviet Union. So this is our first Eastern European country, which was a former Soviet bloc country. Part of the Soviet Union, not even a puppet state. Yeah, not by its own choice, right? But if you look here, you're going to see a lot of similarities. Rule of law, procedural justice, criminal justice. Now, again, when you look at criminal justice, an important thing to note here is Cato tends to be more libertarian. So they tend to have a different view on criminal justice reforms. So there might be some people that have a more conservative bent that look at this and say, all right, well, why do they score lower in criminal justice? And it might be that there's essentially criminal law may be associated with drugs, maybe associated with marijuana. I don't know. I'm just saying in general. If you see a lower score there's some people that might look at that and be like, well, I don't have a problem with that. But it ends up scoring them lower in the view of what is essentially a libertarian philosophy that's making these rankings.
By the way, the reason that Estonia is what it is in terms of its positioning on this scoreboard is in large part because the liberals have been in control of the Estonian parliament for many, many years now. And liberalism in the international stage is not the same thing as when we say liberalism in the United States. Liberalism in a country like Estonia, it's technically the Reform Party. Liberalism in Estonia is economic freedom and personal freedom. It's classical liberalism. It's not progressivism. The
It's
way
a more
that we talk.
libertarian view of
Sure, a mild form.
Yeah,
we
yeah,
don't
very,
mean
very
big
mild.
L libertarian.
Very mild. Yeah. But they're the sort of people, when you hear people like in the United States, republicanism has generally been associated with, well, theoretically, it's supposed to be associated with free market economics and rule of law and ordered liberty and things like that. Whereas a more libertarian view of these things, essentially on a lot of the social issues, takes a different bent on everything from the drug war to marriage to things like that.
Someone asked if the high score is better or worse.
High score on this is better.
Okay.
High score on this is better. All right, go ahead and scroll down a little bit. So again, you see the same thing across the board with associations, civil liberties, expression and information. This is one part where they just crush it in the personal freedom. And I think we did a video a while back on Lithuania and some of the things that happened during the fall of the Soviet Union. There is such an emphasis on freedom of the press and freedom of expression, I think in large part because you have generations that are old enough to remember the violent suppression of it and have been very, very adamant about making sure that it was open. The other thing on relationships here, this one's, again, they take more of a libertarian. This is one where, again, they
and we just did a podcast on this
Cato
topic.
places huge emphasis on, government recognition of a variety of different marriages.
See, it seems like they would want government out of it if they were libertarian.
Well, and if you actually sit down with a libertarian and discuss this, that is the position that they'll usually take, is that they don't want the government defining it. But if the government is going to define it, then they want to broaden the definition. And that's where I break with libertarians.
But it also requires force in these other countries to force religious organizations to uphold their law.
Well, it depends on the way in which you have this. So, like,
sure, it depends, but like the reality is, you've got all these countries where, churches are definitely being infringed, but you don't see anything under religion in there.
No, there is
As a score. Where
freedom
is
of
that?
religion.
Yeah,
is
freedom of religion
if
is
you
there as
scroll
well.
up.
This is about relationships,
Okay.
not religion.
Yeah.
So
So
it seems like
also
it seems a bit
association, assembly,
skewed.
and civil society, freedom of assembly, freedom of forum to run political parties, civil society repression.
I feel like they're missing something here.
I mean, this is where I'm just saying this is a difference of opinion sometimes between
By the
people
way,
more traditionally
and we
conservative
also brought up that we're not going to agree with everything in these rankings, right? We're giving one set of rankings. We have another set of rankings that we're going to get to closer to the end of this podcast that's also a little bit more recent that I think and Nick thinks is kind of gonna highlight how it depends on the category you're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
In some categories, you can say, think about it like this. If you had a society where that question can only be answered by yourself ultimately, depending on what you value. The people at this table, I think the thing that we value more than anything else is economic freedom, because I don't think you can have freedom without economic freedom. Otherwise, you're just voting on who's going to be running your life for you. And I don't view that as freedom. If you don't have property rights, if you don't have economic freedom, then it doesn't matter who you're electing to office, because you're just basically electing your dictator.
Yeah. Well, let's go. So let's look at a couple more of these here, just to see how it. So go over to the next column. Yeah. And there you go. One of the things that they score higher here is on the government consumption. So they don't have as significant issues with the overall size of government, transfers, subsidies. This is going to be something where I think over time, the transfers and subsidies issue is really going to be problematic across any country that has essentially chosen to make the government responsible for ever-growing social safety nets, and here's why. It's really easy for people to point at something, like to point at the worst case scenario. That's like the elderly person who has no family left, who's completely destitute. It's the person that through no fault of their own, through natural disaster or whatnot, needs assistance. It's the single mom scenario. Like it's all of these things that are used to show that, my gosh, shouldn't we have some sort of like safety net of last resort, right? They for some reason, they can't take care of themselves. They don't have a family to do it. They don't have a strong friend network to do it. There's not enough civic organizations in the particular area. Shouldn't there be something as a last resort? And most people look at that and say, well, this seems to make sense. Here's what you need to understand on the political incentive side. The more politicians can essentially hand stuff out, right, the better it is for them electorally. And so there is always a push to move more and more people into the category of qualifying for transfer and subsidy payments. Always, right? And I'll tell you why. If you have a family, because you got to write the line somewhere on a transfer or subsidy, right? Some sort of welfare program. You've got to draw the line somewhere, which means there's a dollar amount somewhere where you're eligible for it here, but you're not eligible for it here. And you can always find, once again, somebody that it is very sympathetic, that is just barely doesn't qualify for whatever the subsidy or the transfer payment is. And so you make the argument that, well, shouldn't this person qualify? And most people are like, yeah, I get it. That's a unique situation. And so they change the goalposts. And then what happens? Well, now you have another category of people that are they just barely don't qualify. And over time, that just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it ends up becoming a situation where more and more people are taking out of that public pot than are actually putting into it. And what happens is you reach a certain level of insolvency. Well, do you think those same politicians are going to come back and say, oh gosh, we were wrong, this wasn't long-term sustainable? No, they're going to create enemies. There's a reason why it's not working. It's because of greedy people over there. And if only these politicians had more control over the economy, they'd be able to fix it. So that's why whenever I look at things like government consumption, transfers and subsidies, I get really, really worried. State ownership of assets, I get really, really worried about that, because I look at that as a fragile system over the long term. But Estonia is doing better in those categories. Go ahead and scroll down. Again, you kind of see similarities here across the board with the other countries. We're not talking about major shifts. Whenever they talk about labor market regulations, a lot of that has to do with labor laws, unionization, things of that nature. And this is interesting because there's a lot of people, we actually talked about this once, and there's a lot of people that look at a job as something that the laborer owns. And this is a very, very important distinction. So in Virginia, we have what they call right to work, which is to say that you can't be forced to join a union within the Commonwealth of Virginia. We also have at-will employment, which is to say that if your employer wants to fire you, as long as they're not firing you based off of something that violates state or federal law, like they can't fire you based off of your race or something like that. But if they decide they want to fire you, they can fire you. You're not required some big elaborate explanation. Now, a lot of people look at that and they have this kind of visceral reaction. Well, that's not fair. That's not good. Well, there can certainly be times where it's inappropriate or it's wrong or it's cold-hearted. But the question comes as one of property rights. So when a business creates a job, the job doesn't belong to the person they pay to do the job. The job belongs to the business. It has to, by necessity, belong to the business. What belongs to the person that is doing the job is their labor. And while the laborer should absolutely sell their labor, their talents, whatever it is that they're providing to the relationship, they should sell it at the best price they can possibly get to a company that is going to treat them with dignity and respect. Of course, they should do all of those things. However, the company also has a right to hire the best person for the best price possible. So it's a little bit ridiculous to say that, a business is exploiting labor provided that the labor voluntarily chose that job. If the labor comes back and says, we want more money for our labor, we don't say, you're exploiting the business. No, in a free transaction between labor and the employer, both sides are able to come to the table and determine how they're going to negotiate things like hours, pay, benefits, and things of that nature. And so when you see a lower score on labor market regulations, typically what that is the government putting their hand on the scale for labor unions. Now, you can argue all day long that you think that's better for the laborer. I would argue that that's actually a problematic argument.
Ultimately, it is not. In the short run, it is, but ultimately, it is not. And the reason why, like, here's a good example. In France, it's basically impossible to fire somebody. It is virtually impossible to fire somebody from a job. And so businesses are extremely hesitant to hire anybody for anything. There's a relatively low unemployment rate in France because a lot of people have jobs, but
there's a high youth unemployment rate.
There is a high youth unemployment. It hurts younger people more than anybody else who don't yet have marketable skills. That's a phrase that my friend Tyler, the other Tyler, the one that's in politics, that lives in Harrisonburg, that I remember he used once.
He's doxing his friend over here.
But like it is the problem with societies like that when you make it extremely difficult to fire an employee is that you also intrinsically make it extremely difficult to hire one because businesses are going to be extremely hesitant to do so. And ultimately what that does is that it doesn't equip people with new skills. So the reason the United States is the economic juggernaut that it is because how many times have you seen somebody who becomes a multimillionaire or multi-billionaire that started off working for another company, acquired some skills, and then used that to start their own business?
The vast majority of them. There's this idea that everybody that has this level of money just inherited all of it, where it's like, wait a second, 70% of the people in the top 1% income bracket won't be there next year.
Jeff Bezos worked at IBM before he started Amazon. And he used the skills that he acquired working there in order to build the idea that he had that eventually became Amazon. And there's so many examples of stuff like that. So the whole contracts thing and like labor relations and stuff like that, that's, Cato only lists that as one of many, but that's actually quite high on the list.
If this was weighted, that would be, and maybe
I would weight it pretty significantly.
Yeah. All right, let's go to the next country. All right, this one I take some issue with. Now you can see why they ranked it. You can see why they ranked it higher. And if you look at things like size of government,
what's the country for our audio
New Zealand.
listeners?
Sorry, this is New Zealand. New Zealand is ranked number 2. It's ranked 11th in personal freedom and 4th in economic freedom. Scroll down a little bit. We're not going to spend too much time on this, other than to say that I got some issues with this. They score very, very high on personal freedom across the board. There's some issues with disappearances, conflicts, and terrorism, which quite frankly surprises me. Go ahead and scroll down some more.
That's actually really interesting. Maybe that involves something with the native population. I have no idea.
They're pretty high in expression and information and relationships. Then you go over to the other side on the economic side. The freedom to trade internationally is pretty high. Their movement of capital and people, they get a little bit lower score. That's kind of interesting because obviously we're talking about. It's more than 2 islands, but predominantly 2 islands in the South Pacific.
That's why that's why they have a lower freedom of movement, because at the end of the day, you see this with some of these countries that are like inherently the geography makes it easier for them to be isolated from the rest of the world.
Yeah.
There's always a segment of people within those countries that are like, we don't want to make it easy for people to move here because we want to pick and choose who we want to allow into our country. You have the same thing in Japan, where it's like, they would score abysmally in terms of freedom of
Japan
movement.
has a very, very tough.
They want you to visit.
Policy.
They don't want you to stay.
Yeah. Go ahead and scroll up a little bit because I want to point something out here. One of the reasons why they do so well on the economic freedom side has to do with the size of government scores, because you'll notice they are like on a lot of these countries. Once you start get up into the top 5, you're talking about fairly minor differences between 1 versus 2 versus 3. They actually do fairly better on government consumption, transfers, and subsidies. I don't think it's trending in that direction in New Zealand. I think New Zealand is going to be...
Socialists are in charge right now.
I don't think New Zealand's going to be ranked 2 on this next time around. I mean, maybe they can prove some of their human freedom scores.
So, by the way,
I think their economic freedom is going to be going down.
It's worth noting that there's a difference between a country's ranking compared to the entire rest of the world and the country's ranking intrinsically in of itself. So here's what I mean by that. New Zealand is currently ranked number 2 in the entire world, according to Cato, on their Human Freedom Index. But look at their score. New Zealand's score 8.75 as of their latest ranking. But historically, this is something that I've been paying attention to as you've been going through this entire list.
Yeah.
Country after country after country, their score, not their ranking compared to other countries, but their intrinsic score has been on the decline.
Yeah.
New Zealand used to be ranked over 9, got a score of over 9. Now it's 8.75. And you see since 2016, and especially in the lead up to 2020, including 2020, it fell off a cliff. This report actually does include the very beginning of COVID, so it makes sense. It doesn't include the entire story of COVID, but it includes the beginning of COVID, so it makes sense that a country like New Zealand, which went through extreme lockdowns during COVID, would fall off a cliff. Hamilton, if you go back to, can you briefly click on some of the previous countries we went to? Because I just want to look at the score. You see it country after country. Yeah. New Zealand, scroll up just a little bit, Hamilton. This is Estonia. Yeah. Even Estonia briefly does dip, although in the grand scheme of things, it's actually still higher than where it was 20 years ago. This is raw score.
Yeah.
Go to the next one.
Yeah, they all
Denmark dips.
This is the COVID dip.
Go to the first one, which is Ireland. Ireland dips as well. So what's worth noting is that a country could go. It's actually happened in some cases. A country could go up on the list, right? They could jump up a place or two places, but their actual raw score could drop, and that's indicative of the fact that, quite frankly, and I think a lot of people know this, especially if they're watching this podcast or listening to us. Freedom is retreating around the world right now.
Well, I mean, the COVID really caused a lot of countries, at an institutional level, caused a lot of people to actually question their commitment to individual choices in a time of crisis. Now, there's always, let's be fair about this. There have always been cases where you've had international pandemics, world wars, and things like that, where we all know that civil liberties take a nosedive, right? It just happens. The question is what does the recovery look like post-crisis? And has the government actually expanded post-crisis in such a way to where it doesn't retreat back? And what we generally see, and Jefferson talked about this, is that typically speaking, government continually expands at a rate far beyond what you might be able to use to justify based off of things like, population growth or things of that nature. It just continually expands. And that's the problem that we have right now, and I think a lot of people are watching, is to see, okay, what happens now. Obviously, we had a major infringements on civil liberties across the world, economic freedoms across the world, and there's been a significant recovery from that. Obviously, we don't have the economy locked down anymore in the United States. But what is a little bit scary is when you start reading opinion polls of people, not just in the United States, but in other countries, who were perfectly comfortable with the idea of jailing people that didn't get a vaccination. That's a little bit scary. And it was almost always the more left-wing you were, the more comfortable you were with imprisoning people that didn't get a vaccine.
Oh, it was worse than that. It would be imprisoning people that went out in public to protest lockdowns, even if they were themselves vaccinated. And also imprisoning people who spread disinformation about either vaccines or lockdowns or government policies. I'm sorry, but when you get to a point where where significant chunks of the population, in some countries a majority, supported the government imprisoning people or otherwise punishing them for voicing opposition to government policies, that's when you start having like tyranny start to creep in.
That's when it gets a little scary, is this idea that they could just shut you down. It is one thing for them to say, let's put this in the most favorable light possible. It is one thing to say, hey, we've got let's say early days of COVID, early days, right? All right, look, we don't know what this is going to do. We don't know how bad it's going to be. We're still figuring things out. We need everyone to be cautious and careful. And oh, by the way, we're shutting down like major gatherings and sporting events. Now, I might not have liked that, but I would have understood the reasoning behind it. But when you go beyond that, when you go beyond something that's practical, but when the same people are saying, no, it's perfectly fine to go march in the street and spray paint buildings, like defund the police and, F the police and everything else. But if you go to church, that's going to be responsible for the death of civilization, Right, that's the part where we started to see right off the bat, like, wait a second, you're not as committed to this as you told us you were. But if anybody else says something against the government narrative, you're going to work. And now we know from the Twitter files and everything else, you are going to work with social media companies to essentially apply pressure to shut them down, cancel them, dox them. I mean, that's the part where it's like you allowed for a threshold of government interference and censorship that was, quite frankly, terrifying. And I don't know that a lot of Americans, I think a lot of Americans that were already mad about it from the beginning stayed mad about it. I think there were some people like Bill Maher that said, yeah, this has gone too far. What really concerns me is the 35-40% of the far more like left-wing progressive who didn't think it went far enough and that still don't think it went far enough. Like, even when you've shown them all the evidence that this was problematic, they didn't. And that's where, when you look at these scores and you look at freedom of the press, I mean, that was, and not just freedom of the press, right? Because the press sometimes was complicit in doing this. They were calling for censorship.
It's more freedom of expression.
Yes.
And freedom of assembly and freedom of speech, not necessarily freedom of the press. Because, as you said, a lot of times in a lot of these countries, and also a lot of these countries have basically state media, right? You know, the BBC is taxpayer funded in the UK, for example, right? Same thing with the ABC in Australia.
This is why when people get on to, conservatives or libertarian people in the United States, like, whoa, you want to get rid of PBS? Oh, you want to get rid of Sesame Street? No, we don't like the idea of state-run media. Like that's the part that we don't like. That's the part that we find problematic. Also, we don't like it when the state comes in and essentially leverages its power to threaten privately owned media to do what they want. That's also problematic. All right, listen, let's go to I know we're having some issues with syncing up. Are we going to try to fix that, or what do you need us to do?
We're going to restart the stream.
There's no way to fix it unless we restart the stream, but we wouldn't be restarting the episode completely. We would just be picking up where we left off, because a lot of people are finding it hard to follow the charts.
Yeah, I got all that. What do you want to do?
How long will it take to restart?
Hamilton, what do you want to do?
About 5 minutes. We're going to cut for 5 minutes. We'll be right back. You should get a notification. We'll be live on all the channels.
All right, so stick with us, because in 5 minutes we're going to come back, sync everything else up, and we're going to talk about what is ranked the number one